Scary telling.
As I grew older and started to learn more about the world, I came to realize that my grandfather's experiences during the war were not unique. There were countless stories of soldiers who had witnessed and committed atrocities during times of war. I started to read books and watch documentaries about war, trying to understand how such horrors could happen. And I realized that the legacy of war was a complex and tangled web of emotions and experiences that could affect people for years, even decades, after the conflict had ended. I thought about my grandfather and how the war had changed him, how it had taken something from him that he could never get back. And I wondered how many other soldiers had been affected in the same way. I started to research the psychological effects of war, learning about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other mental illnesses that could be caused by exposure to extreme violence and trauma. I realized that my grandfather had likely been suffering from some form of PTSD, and that his obsession with cannibalism was a symptom of his illness. But I also knew that the legacy of war went deeper than just mental illness. It was a cultural phenomenon, something that affected whole societies and nations. And I started to wonder how we as a society could come to terms with the horror of war, how we could prevent future generations from experiencing the same trauma and devastation. I started to volunteer at a veteran support group, helping soldiers who had returned from war to adjust to civilian life. It was hard work, but it was also rewarding. I felt like I was making a difference, like I was helping to ease some of the pain and suffering that war had caused. I also started to write more about my grandfather's experiences, using his stories as a way to educate others about the horrors of war. I wrote articles for magazines and newspapers, and even started to work on a book about the legacy of war. But the more I learned, the more I realized how much I still had to learn. War was a vast and complex topic, one that could never be fully understood or comprehended. But I knew that it was important to keep trying, to keep exploring the dark corners of our collective history in order to find some shred of meaning and understanding. I realized that my grandfather's stories of cannibalism were just a small part of a much larger narrative, one that encompassed the entire world and the entire history of human conflict. And I knew that I had a responsibility to bear witness to that narrative, to help others understand the true cost of war. In the end, I came to understand that war was not just about death and destruction. It was also about the human spirit, about the resilience and courage that people can show in the face of unimaginable horror. And I knew that it was up to us, as a society, to honor that spirit and to work towards a world where war was no longer necessary. But I also knew that the legacy of war would never truly be erased, that it would always be a part of who we are as human beings. And I hoped that by telling my grandfather's story, by bearing witness to his pain and suffering, I could help to create a world where the horrors of war would be remembered, but never repeated. Years passed, and I continued to write about war and its impact on society. I spoke at conferences and gave lectures, trying to spread awareness about the legacy of war and the need for peace. But even as I worked towards a better future, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unfinished business with my past. I knew that I needed to confront my grandfather, to talk to him about what had happened and how it had affected me. So I reached out to him, sending him a letter and asking if we could meet. To my surprise, he agreed. We met at a cafe in his hometown, sitting across from each other and sipping coffee. I could see the years on his face, the lines and wrinkles that had etched themselves deep into his skin. But I could also see a sense of calm and acceptance that hadn't been there before. We talked for hours about his experiences during the war and how they had affected him. He told me about the hunger and madness that had consumed him, about the times when he had felt like he was losing his mind. But he also talked about the love that he had for his family, about how they had helped him to find his way back to sanity. And he talked about his regret, about how he wished that he could go back and do things differently. I know that I can never make up for what I did, he said, his voice choked with emotion. But but I want you to know that I am sorry. From the bottom of my heart, I am sorry for scaring you and causing you so much pain." I could see the tears in his eyes, and I knew that he meant it. I felt a sense of catharsis, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. "I forgive you, grandfather," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I understand that you were suffering and that you did the best that you could. And I want you to know that I love you and that I always will." We sat there in silence for a while, just holding hands and looking at each other. And I realized that we had come full circle, that the darkness and pain of our past had been transformed into something beautiful and redemptive. In the end, I came to realize that the legacy of war is not just one of horror and destruction. It is also a legacy of love and compassion, of the human spirit's ability to endure and overcome even the greatest of tragedies. And I knew that it was up to me, and to all of us, to keep that legacy alive, to honor the sacrifice and suffering of those who had come before us, and to work towards a world where war was no longer necessary. As I walked away from the cafe, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind, I knew that I had found my purpose. To tell the story of war, of its horrors and its triumphs, of its impact on the human soul. To bear witness to the past, to honor those who had suffered and sacrificed, and to work towards a better future. And I knew that no matter what happened, no matter where life took me, I would always carry that legacy with me, always remember the lessons that I had learned, and always strive to make the world a better place. I remember the day my grandfather told me about the little German girl. He sat me down on his knee, his voice heavy with emotion as he spoke in that fading Russian accent of his. I was just 16 years of age when we stormed Berlin. 16. It was no age for a boy to experience war, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. I still remember this little German girl crying for her dead mother in the middle of the street. She looked no older than 5. She was all covered in the debris of battle. We just ignored her, continuing with our house-to-house sweep as if nothing were wrong. I listened intently as he spoke, my young mind struggling to comprehend the horror of war. I couldn't imagine leaving a crying child alone on the street like that. My grandfather's words shook me to my core. 2 hours later, I found the girl dead, her body completely riddled with bullet holes. One of our guys had got sick of her crying and sprayed her at point-blank range. He put his face into his hands and began to cry. I could have saved her. My heart broke as I watched my strong grandfather weep like a child. I hugged him, trying to offer some comfort, but he was inconsolable. "It's not okay. I left her to die." He wiped away his tears. They dragged her body away like a slaughtered animal. My own comrades, the so-called Glorious Red Army, took her into a bombed-out pub and cooked her like a hog over a flame. He paused briefly. "And do you know what eats me up the most? She smelled really good." I felt a chill run down my spine as my grandfather spoke those words. It was like a dark cloud had descended upon the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. They ate her arms first, spitting bullet fragments as they chewed. And in the air lingered the aroma of cooked pork. I watched them eat as saliva dribbled from my mouth like a drooling dog begging for scraps. Only the girl's charred head remained when they were finished. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandfather, a war hero, had witnessed and even participated in cannibalism. I felt sick to my stomach and wished I could unhear his words. "I don't want to hear any more," I said, trying to pull away from him. "The hunger always wins, boy, always." Weeks of starvation had overwhelmed me to the point of madness. It was like I had lost control of my body. I cut away a piece of her cheek and ate it. And after consuming both cheeks, I plunged my blade into her temple, then slurped her brain out like a thick, delicious soup. I recoiled in horror as my grandfather described his cannibalistic act. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could anyone do such a thing? "Granddad, you're hurting me," I said, trying to fight free of his iron grasp. "It was the best damn meal I have ever eaten, Ralph," he said, his eyes blazing with a strange light. I pulled away from him and ran out of the room, my mind reeling from the shock of what I had just heard. I couldn't look at my grandfather the same way after that. The war had taken something from him, something that could never be replaced. And I realized that maybe it had taken something from me too. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me whenever I was around my grandfather. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, but he would always seek me out and tell me stories from his time in the war. His stories were always filled with violence and death, and sometimes he would even talk about cannibalism again. As I grew older, I started to notice that my grandfather's behavior was becoming more erratic. He would mutter to himself, and sometimes he would stare at me with a look that made my skin crawl. I started to wonder if he was going crazy. One night, I woke up to find him standing over me with a wild look in his eyes. He was muttering to himself and holding a knife. I screamed for my mother, but she didn't come. My grandfather eventually left the room, but I was left shaken and traumatized by the experience. I started to do some research into cannibalism, trying to understand why someone would do such a thing. I read about the Donner Party and the case of Armand Maywes, who had killed and eaten a man he met online. It was all so disturbing, and I couldn't believe that my own grandfather was capable of such things. One day, I decided to confront him about his behavior. I sat him down and asked him why he had told me those stories about cannibalism. He looked at me with a strange expression on his face, like he was trying to decide whether or not to tell me something. "The war changes a man, Ralph," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It takes something from you, something that can never be replaced." I saw things, did things, that I can never forget. I listened to him, trying to understand what he was saying. He told me about the hunger and the madness that had consumed him during the war, about the times when he had been so desperate for food that he had eaten rats and even other people. "It's like a hunger that never goes away," he said. "It's always there, lurking in the back of your mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. And sometimes, it's hard to resist." I was horrified by what he was saying, but I couldn't stop listening. It was like a train wreck that I couldn't look away from. "I've never told anyone this before, Ralph," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes, I get these urges to taste human flesh again. And it scares me, because I know where it could lead." I felt a chill run down my spine as my grandfather spoke those words. I knew that he was sick, that he needed help, but I didn't know how to help him. I felt like I was in way over my head. From that day on, I kept a closer eye on my grandfather. I didn't want him to hurt anyone, and I was afraid that he might snap at any moment. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that something inside of me had been awakened, something dark and dangerous that I couldn't control. I started to have nightmares about cannibalism, about being consumed by my own hunger and madness. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was slowly spiraling out of control. And I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. One night, I woke up to find my grandfather standing over me with a knife in his hand. He was muttering to himself, his eyes wild and frenzied. I could see the hunger and madness in his eyes, and I knew that I was in danger. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed with fear, like I couldn't move or do anything to protect myself. My grandfather started to move closer to me, his knife glinting in the moonlight. I could see the sweat on his forehead, the veins bulging in his neck. He was like a wild animal, and I knew that he would kill me if I didn't do something. I kicked out at him, hitting him in the stomach with my foot. He stumbled backward, his knife clattering to the ground. I scrambled out of bed and ran for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst into my parents' room, panting and shaking with fear. They woke up and asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. I was too scared, too traumatized by what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to tell them what had happened. They were horrified and called the police, who came and took my grandfather away. I never saw him again after that night.